Morning, friends. I welcome you all to this interesting lecture series. Um, and today we are going to discuss one of the most interesting but one of the most complex areas of research. The topic for today's discussion is colonialism, transfiguration of caste, and making of caste movements. Uh, the basic objective of this lecture is to understand, analyze historically and critically how colonialism shaped the notion of caste. So the intention of this lecture is not to claim that there was no caste system before colonial period. On the contrary, the primary objective of today's lecture is to suggest and to understand how colonialism played a very important role in shaping, solidifying, and strengthening the caste system that we see today. Right. Unlike other subjects, discussing caste is a very difficult job to do, because as far as the question of caste is concerned, most of us have more questions than answers. For example, there are questions like how did the notion of varna led to the emergence of jati and then to caste? How did the fluid nature of varna and caste in the early medieval period started changing, and how the fluid nature of varna and caste system was narrated in the medieval accounts by rulers or travelers and other important accounts, and what kind of encounter colonialism had with the varna or caste system. How did the colonial agencies perceive caste system? Can we think, therefore, that colonial construction of caste solidified the caste that we see today? How did the Indian intellectuals, social reformers, and other inquisitive minds attempted to perceive caste system? So these are some of the questions that we will be trying to raise, and on this background we will also be having two important case studies: how Indian intellectuals and social reformers like Jyotiba Phule and Ambedkar tried to perceive caste system. So my argument in this particular discussion will be how colonialism shaped and reshaped the notion of caste that we see today. I have a couple of points to make here. Number one, the interdisciplinary scholarship on the historical caste system, the evolution of caste system particularly, reveals that the Brahmanical Hinduism, as it has been understood, sowed the seeds of varna system or jati system. This is a popular notion that most of the scholars agree with. And second point, which I want to share with you, is the same Brahmanical Hinduism also nurtured the Varna system through Hindu texts and codified laws and other religious symbolic representations in the ancient and early medieval India. This is also a popular uh, understanding. And the third important point, the Varna system throughout the historical period was intended primarily to function as a sort of division of labor. Now, the question is, despite the fact that the division of labor created a stratified society by making a range of social groups such as priests, warriors, traders, skilled and unskilled laborers, it also endeavored to divide the laborers over a period of time on the basis of power, privilege, and position. So, what I am trying to argue is the Varna system was not only on the basis of the division of labor, but also it endeavored to divide the laborers, as Ambedkar would argue. And the next important point that I would like to share here is, nevertheless, it was colonialism that made this unsophisticated and obvious Varna system to grow rapidly into a complicated million-headed hydra. So this is my term, how the unsophisticated and obvious Varna system that existed in the ancient and early medieval period, and of course till the colonial times, was made to grow rapidly into a complicated million-headed hydra through its forms of knowledge and imperial ideologies. Scholars like Bernard S. Cohen and others argued persuasively on this point. The next point that I would like to emphasize here is, consequently, it may be easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a genuinely reasonable person to be resilient about the possibility of a total elimination of this million-headed hydra called caste system from the Indian society. The last point that I would like to discuss before I go into the details of my actual discussion is, this is to suggest that every single active caste group in contemporary India continues to shape, strengthen, and solidify this million-headed hydra in one way or the other, persistently, assiduously, and consciously. Consequently, the question is, it would be hardly making any sense if the Brahmanical Hinduism, as we see it today, is embattled or is targeted as the only definite apparatus for keeping this million-headed hydra alive. So now this is my research question. Is it possible, is it justifiable, therefore, to target the Brahmanical Hinduism that we see today as the one and only definite apparatus for keeping this million-headed hydra alive, or we do have so many other factors as well for keeping this million-headed hydra called caste system alive? Right. So, having said this, these are all my observations. Having said this, I'll try to explain one by one how this Varna system was explicitly expressed in ancient and early medieval literature. For example, of course, there are references in the Rig Veda in its 10th mandala about Varna system that we all know. And coming back to the medieval period, of course, the Mughal chronicler Abul Fasl in his Aini-Akbari informs us that there were 4 Varnas during the Mughal period. And 16th century discourse of caste and Varna has been thoroughly studied by different scholars. And of course, as Nicholas B. Dirks in his Castes of Mind argues, that the Portuguese were credited with the initial use of the term casta to refer to the social order of India, though the first use of the word was applied to the lowest Indian classes. So now the question is, it was the Portuguese who tried to come out with the term casta. So what we see caste today, therefore, can be traced back to the Portuguese term casta to refer to the social order of India, despite the fact that the term was used in the beginning period to refer to the lowest Indian classes. It started attracting a great deal of attention of different scholars. For example, you have a series of colonial missionaries who came to India from the Portuguese period, because where there were Portuguese colonies, there were Portuguese missionaries. Where there were Dutch colonies in India, there were Dutch missionaries. Where there were English colonies, there were also English missionaries. So the point which I am trying to suggest is there was a kind of close nexus between colonialism and the colonial agencies like missionaries. And these missionaries therefore started taking this issue up very seriously, even more than the colonial governments itself, particularly the Portuguese. And you have Francis Xavier, who came to India during the 16th century, found it very difficult to convert the people of the so-called upper sections of the society. So he converted himself to be a kind of Brahmin to attract the attention of the elite sections. That itself says a lot how the missionaries try to see caste as one of the most important obstacles for their conversion project. So I think, therefore, this is also part of my research, how the missionaries, therefore, had taken this issue up seriously, and the colonial ethnographers and were also part of the colonial government as officials also started working on the notion of Varna or Jati or caste system more seriously, more than ever before, from the Portuguese time onwards. And if you look at the 17th century, the French traveler Tavernier visited India, as we all know, in the middle of the 17th century. He hardly mentions anything substantial about castes, though he was informed by the priestly communities that there were 72 castes at that point in time, the 17th century. Nevertheless, these castes were classified broadly under 4 principal castes that we all know: Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Sudras. And similarly, there were scholars, as I told you, colonial ethnographers, anthropologists, who were also an integral part of the colonial government, including Abbé Dubois, G.S. Gurry, Risley, Richard Eaton, David Schulman, to name a few. There are a range of scholars who have worked extensively on the notion of caste system. They attempted to trace the discourse of caste in the pre-colonial written records because they were desperately looking for references of caste system. But unfortunately, however, during their research, they found that in the writings of the pre-colonial written records, particularly royal court documents and travelers' account, they come to the logical conclusion that there was little or no mention of caste as we understand it today. And what exactly tells us is that the notion of caste or the notion of varna or jati was in a way fluid in nature. It was not solidified like the way we have it today. And it was unsolidified, and therefore the social categories, the social identities in those times were constantly flexible. And interestingly, you will find terms like slaves, menials, merchants, and merchants became kings, farmers became soldiers, and soldiers became farmers, and so on and so forth, became therefore common phenomenon in the pre-colonial times. So what I'm trying to say here is we are not completely dismissing that there was no idea of caste in the pre-colonial system. So what we understand from different historical literature is that the nature of caste in the pre-colonial times was flexible, fluid, and unsolidified. Right. And now the question is, if this is unsolidified, if this is fluid, if this is not constructed properly, how did the colonialism produce knowledge on varna or caste? Who gave them the idea to create knowledge? How did the colonialism come out with knowledge on caste? There are many scholars who have worked on this. I just make one brief reference to a scholarly study made by historian Philip Wegener. Philip Wegener, in his study Pre-Colonial Intellectuals and the Production of Colonial Knowledge, he argues persuasively that there has been a series of debates about how colonialism produced knowledge. And these debates continue to hold the view that the colonizers persistently attempted to achieve domination over the colonized subjects through knowledge and power. And Philip also argues that there are two kinds of schools of thought on colonial knowledge. The first school of thought holds the view that the production of colonial knowledge, in the production of the colonial knowledge, the role of the colonized or the members of colonies was insignificant. So the colonized therefore played insignificant role, and their role was negligible. What does exactly mean? They were acting like merely as passive informants. As passive informants, the colonized provided only raw information, and it was the active European colonizers who were able to produce the knowledge. Right? This is very, very clear. This is how the colonizers therefore were able to make use of the raw information provided by the colonized. particularly the people of India, were able to give some kind of raw materials to the colonial government, and the colonial government was able to make use of it and was able to produce knowledge. In fact, the colonizers created knowledge by imposing imported modes of knowing upon the raw data of the local society. And these scholars have an unshakable conviction. These scholars have an unshakable conviction that knowledge is power. And therefore, they wanted to accumulate as much knowledge as possible, because for them, knowledge means nothing but power. And they also argued persuasively that colonial knowledge did not and did play a fundamental role in the consolidation of colonial rule. You need to remember here, one thing is very clear: how the colonial government therefore played a very important role in creating knowledge system by the information provided by the colonized. The second important school of thought, which also talks about how the colonial government was able to create knowledge, because in the first category, the people of the colonized played insignificant role. But the second school of thought holds the view that the indigenous intellectuals in reality contributed extensively in the process of the making of knowledge. Accordingly, the contribution of indigenous intellectuals was significant and cannot be ignored. So in the second category, therefore, it's very important how the local or indigenous intellectuals played a very significant role in the making of knowledge, and consequently the colonial knowledge was possible largely due to the active collaboration between colonizers and colonized. So I am taking all these instances so that we will be able to understand the relationship, the significant relationship between colonialism and the making of caste consciousness. And the colonial knowledge therefore was produced through a process of colonial knowledge therefore was produced through a process of epistemic confrontation and adjustment between European and indigenous knowledge systems. Now the question is, why did the Europeans study caste? What made them to have a passion for studying caste system? There are many studies which attempted to answer this particular question. Why did the Europeans study Indian caste system? And as Edward said in his important work, Orientalism, this was published in 1978, he argues persuasively that the predominant objective of the Europeans to study the non-Europeans was to have dominion over them. The objective behind, for example, he maintains race theory, ideas about primitive origins and primitive classifications, the process of civilization, the destiny of the white races, and the need for colonial territories was always to raise Europe to have dominion over non-European portions of mankind. So the objective therefore is very clear. Why did the colonial government show interest to study the social categories of the people? And we understand the predominant objective of the colonial government was to have dominion over non-Europeans. In this case, particularly the people of India. Now the question is, in the colonial times, in the colonial time, as I have been emphasizing how colonialism played an important role in creating knowledge system on caste during colonial government, the process of conceptualizing caste categories therefore became inevitable. So the classification and the conceptualization of caste became the order of the day during the colonial times. For example, there are a number of studies which suggest the close linkage between colonialism, administrative empiricism, and the conceptualizing caste categories. You see, always remember, it is to suggest that how colonialism played an important role in conceptualizing caste categories. And there are many studies. Most importantly, you have Bernard S. Cohen. He has published a very important work titled Colonialism and Its Forms of Knowledge. And secondly, you have Rashmi Pant's The Cognitive Status of Caste in Colonial Ethnography. And third, Nicholas B. Dirks' Castes of Mind, David Ludden's Orientalist Empiricism, and you also have Arjuna Padurai's Number in the Colonial Imagination, to name a few, have argued persuasively that the administrative empiricism of the colonial British was primarily responsible for conceptualizing caste categories through a number of ways. Remember, this is how colonialism played very important role in constructing castes as a social category. And it is in this context I need to mention a few important aspects. How colonialism, through its census, created consciousness of caste. For example, census became the most powerful tool to create caste consciousness. How do I know about my caste? How do you know about your caste? How do other people know about their caste? Through census, or through a community certificate, or through the classification by the government. Otherwise, we hardly understand about our own identity. So therefore, colonialism played a very, very crucial role in solidifying the caste system through a variety of ways. For example, census, among other administrative initiatives, played a crucial role in conceptualizing caste categories. We all know that the process of census in India began in 1860s, but the first ever census was conducted in India in 1881. So as we all know, 1881 was for the first time census was conducted, not necessarily based on caste, but other categories. And it is very important. But in 1901, of course, there were classifications of people on the basis of Varna, or basis of Jati, or based on profession. But most importantly, the 1901 census, under the direction of Herbert Risley, becomes historically significant. You know why? Because it sought to collect information on the social hierarchy based on caste through his racial theory. So for the first time, caste played a significant role in the census report in the year 1901 by Herbert Risley. As we all know, consequently, therefore, representatives of different castes addressed hundreds of petitions to the census commissioner because they felt that their community was in a way underrepresented because they continued to claim higher status through ancient religious texts. But now the colonial government also had to listen to their observations and petitions, and in some cases the colonial government had to change the status of those people because those people who claimed themselves as Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Sudras think that their status was forcefully undermined by the colonial government. So now the question is, it is in this context there are so many theories started coming up. Whether the Brahmins were responsible for the strengthening of the caste system, or was the Hinduism was responsible for the strengthening of caste system, or was the division of labor which led to the strengthening of caste system over a period of time. And there are so many other theories started coming up in the colonial times. Remember, there were more theories in the colonial times, and these theories therefore either produced or reproduced by the post-colonial scholars in different ways to suit their ideology. And again, I am underlying, therefore, colonialism not only created theories but also created a scope where the post-colonial scholars were able to rely on the accounts of the colonial documents. This is very, very clear. And it is in this context, the first important authoritative study was made by Abbe Dubois. Abbe Dubois played a very important role, who studied caste system in a detailed way. Who is Abbe Dubois? So he was actually a French Catholic missionary in India, and secondly, he was also a Sanskrit scholar who was ably assisted by the East India Company in publishing his work in English. You see, always most of the missionaries who had a close connection with the colonial government also produced knowledge on caste system. Remember, Abbe Dubois' work was the first intensive and most influential work on caste, and this was published in 1816. What is the title of the book? The title of his book was Description of the Character, Manners, and the Customs of the People of India. As a French missionary, he also performed an anthropological service to the British rulers in India. Remember, he was not only a missionary, he was also an integral part of the colonial government's anthropological service. And after making a detailed survey, Abbe Dubois had an unshakable conviction that Christian mission was destined to fail if it could convert only untouchables and have no success with Brahmins. This is also a point discussed by Nicholas Dirks and others. Because again, I'm emphasizing how and why the colonial missionaries were concerned about the caste system. Because the predominant concern of the colonial missionaries was that they felt that caste was the chief obstacle for their conversion. So that in a way prompted the missionaries to study, critically and historically. And Abbe Dubois is also one such missionary come colonial anthropologist who played a very significant role in the 18th in the 19th century. Now the question is, what was his understanding about caste system? Abbé Dubois was clear in his criticism that the ancient lawgivers were the one who conceived caste system. When we say ancient lawgivers, I think he refers to Manu and his code of law. So according to Abbé Dubois, the result of the political conspiracy of Brahmins and ancient lawgivers to keep their superiority by having control over society played an important role in strengthening the caste system. So he feels therefore the Brahmins need to be blamed for strengthening the caste system because they had a kind of superiority over the rest of the society. And he also emphasized on the role of the Brahmins in the creation of caste system. The Brahmins were solely responsible, according to Abbé Dubois, for creating and maintaining the system so as to retain their authority. So this is how, therefore, he tried to come out with his understanding about caste system. Remember, there are many criticisms about his work, and the criticisms are largely because how his work was in a way sponsored by the colonial government, right? And for example, Nicholas B. Dirks, in his autobiography of an archive, a scholar's passage to India, he argues, very clear argument, Nicholas Dirks making, that Dubois' manuscript was submitted to William Benting. Who was William Benting? William Benting was the governor of Madras during this time in 1806. And this manuscript was purchased by the East India Company itself. And it was translated into English. Remember, this work was published in French. It was obviously written in French. And this work was published and translated into English, and it was published not in India, but it was published for the first time in London in 1816. It raises a series of questions as to how colonialism created a series of controversies in the name of producing knowledge about caste question. And William Benting himself gave contemporary testimony to the importance of Dubois' work. Remember how missionaries and colonialism therefore went hand in hand in producing knowledge during the colonial government. And commenting on the Dubois' work, William Benting stated that Dubois' work was the greatest benefit in helping the servants of the government to conduct themselves according to the customs and prejudices. So that itself says a lot how therefore missionaries as producers of knowledge were also facilitators of the colonial government in various ways. And the second important theory that we can think of that emerged during the colonial government is occupational theory. For example, this theory was introduced by the British anthropologist N.C. Nesfield, J.C. Nesfield. And in this particular work, titled Brief View of the Caste System of the Northwestern Provinces, this book in fact was published in 1885, and Nesfield proposed that the caste system is constructed on the basis of occupation. Remember, he therefore differs from Abbé Dubai's point of view. On the contrary, he says that it was based completely on the nature of occupations. Accordingly, the earlier associations of craftsmen, guilds, for example, in ancient India, developed into various castes. And the hierarchy among them was determined, therefore, predominantly by their occupations. So, if you are a Palmyra climber, and you are supposed to follow the same profession. If you are a washerman, you are supposed to be a washerman. If you are an agriculturalist, you are supposed to follow the same profession. So therefore, the castes played an important role, and it got strengthened through different occupations. And this theory therefore maintains that castes were identified on the basis of fixed occupations. Fixed occupations. For example, those who were noble occupations, such as educating the people, fighting in the battlefield, and trade, were considered as members of superior castes. And similarly, others were considered as belonging to the inferior castes. So you have two important categories. One is superior caste and inferior castes. And Nesfield even cited that the occupation of artisans working in metals was ranked higher than the basket makers or some other primitive occupations. So here we see clearly how occupation played a very important role in shaping the caste system over a period of time. And now this is a time that we need to remember how missionaries played a significant role in terms of creating the consciousness of castes. Or in other words, how they were critical of caste system. As I told you, missionaries' predominant objective to study caste system was that they were under the impression that caste system was the most crucial obstacle for their conversion project, because they were not able to convert the Brahmins, or for that matter, they were not able to convert the Kshatriyas to some extent, and therefore they were intrigued by the fact how this rigidity of caste system should be destroyed so that their conversion project can be made easier. So this is a very, very important observation. And the Protestant missionaries particularly played an important role. And they started quoting a series of biblical verses to suggest that caste was an evil practice. For example, I can quote one such remark made by the missionaries in the 19th century. I quote, this is also a biblical verse as quoted by the missionaries. The quote begins, "There is neither Greek nor Jew, neither slave nor free, neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." So this is a very, very popular verse quoted by the missionaries to create a sentiment against the caste rigidity. But the question is how these missionaries identified caste system. They felt that even after conversion, the converts followed the caste identity, and therefore they were forced to do research in Bombay Presidency, in Madras Presidency, and in Calcutta Presidency. For example, they came to a conclusion that caste sticks to the people as closely as their skins. And they also made remarks like the blood of caste was thicker than the blood of their religion. And thirdly, as a result of which, they came to logical conclusion that caste is Hinduism and Hinduism is caste. You remember when you look at the leaders, most importantly Jyotiba Phule, R.G. Bhandarkar, or Ambedkar, or in Tamil Nadu, E.V.R. Periyar, in Kerala, Ayyankali, and others, and so many other social reformers, therefore, started picking up ideas from colonial ethnographers, colonial anthropologists, and colonial missionaries. So don't think, and let's not assume that whatever they have said completely their own idea. No, never. So what I understand therefore is that the contemporary leaders or the 20th century Indian leaders, the 19th century Indian leaders who had ideas about caste system mostly came from the ideas that existed in the colonial government. Of course, was created by the colonial government and the anthropologists, ethnographers, and the missionaries. So it is very clear now how colonialism and the colonial agencies played a very important role. Let me discuss one more important issue with you before I go into the case studies of the discussion. As I told you already, Herbert Risley, he came out with the racial theory. It's very interesting. This theory was propounded, as we all know, by Herbert Risley. Herbert Risley, in fact, was the first director of ethnography for India, and he was also census superintendent of India. And he argued persuasively that the racial factor is the predominant factor for the evolution of caste. Racial factor. Because in the 19th century, theories started emerging like Aryans and Dravidians, and this is also in a way produced by colonial missionaries to some extent, and others also later followed the observations made by the colonial agencies and the ethnographers and anthropologists. So what is very interesting about Herbert Risley's observation is that he argued that the racial factor is the predominant factor in the evolution of the castes. What exactly he means? For example, in the census of 1901, as we have already discussed, for the first time caste became a predominant factor in the census report. He used the nasal index, right? And in order to distinguish between the Aryans and the non-Aryans, he used the length of the nose. For example, the ideology was based on the two-race theory of Indian history, in which the dark, snub-nosed Dravidians were conquered by the tall, fair, and invading Aryans, who were responsible for the emergence of caste system. It's very clear, therefore, how he was able to make a distinction of the people between Aryans and non-Aryans based on how length their nose is, right? And this caste system therefore attracted, and this observation particularly attracted a great deal of attention, and since then scholars also started arguing that the Dravidian and Aryan are two different races. So this is also therefore a colonial knowledge, and this is very intriguing, and it should be understood critically and historically. So now the question is, there are many scholars who have done research, particularly J.S. Hutton And in fact, a new approach was initiated when J.H. Hutton, as a English-born anthropologist, initiated his study, caste in India. And in fact, this was one of the lost among the foremost scholars of the caste system before India's independence, J.H. Hutton. In fact, Hutton uh, was critical about the existing theories. He was critical about the racial approach. He was even critical about the occupational approach, and he was also was under the impression that there cannot be any particular monolithic construction of caste. You know why? He enumerated at least 15 characteristic features of caste. For example, prominent among them were environmental segregation, magical beliefs, totemism, idea of purity pollution, the doctrine of karma, clash of races, the prejudices concerning complexion of skin, and the tendency to exploit by dint of hierarchy. Remember, so there are multiple factors, according to Hutton, were at work, which shaped and reshaped the notion of caste system in the colonial government. And similarly, you also have scholars in the post-colonial India. French anthropologist Louis Dumas. Louis Dumas played a very significant role in the post-colonial scholarship because his work, Homo Hierarchus, the caste system and its implications. Originally, this book was published in French in 1966. He makes a very, very interesting argument. He says that one cannot speak of the caste without mentioning varnas. Apart from the four major sections, he also traces the fifth section, which is untouchable. He maintains that the Buddhist text also made references to the existence of inferior castes and menial occupations. Similarly, he also claims, and in fact justifies, that the Hindu texts, including Rig Veda, are concerned about entirely with the Varnas. And based on his observations, there are many scholars, including M.N. Srinivas, who is known widely for his work on social stratification, Sanskritization, Westernization, and the notion of dominant caste. He played a very significant role through his scholarship. For example, in his work Caste in Modern India and the Remembered Village, discuss how different castes in Indian villages were interdependent. And it's very important that he also argues that in the contemporary India, and particularly in the modern India, how the building of roads all over India and the introduction of railways, postages, telegraph, cheap paper, and printing, especially in the regional languages, enabled castes to organize as they had never done before. For example, you might ask how postcard played an important role. Postcard also as a small medium, but postcard also played an important role, as M.N. Srinivas argues. That a postcard carried news of a caste meeting, for example, and the railways, how did railway play a significant role in creating caste system? For example, the railways enabled members scattered in far-flung villages to come together when necessary, while the availability of cheap newsprint facilitated the founding of caste journals. Remember, press also played a very important role for shaping of the consciousness of caste in the colonial and post-colonial period. And what I'm trying to suggest, therefore, is how the caste played an important role in the colonial and post-colonial government, and it was shaped and reshaped over a period of time. Again, I am trying to suggest that we are not saying that there was no evidence of caste system in the pre-colonial times. What I am trying to argue is, of course, there were different kinds of stratifications in the society in the pre-colonial times, but those systems were fluid in nature, and therefore it was not very solidified like the way we understand it today. And this becomes possible only after you have a census report, caste community report, and how it was possible by the colonial governments, forms of knowledge and imperial ideologies. And the most important scholar, as we all know, Nicholas B. Dirks, an American academic and former chancellor of the University of California, Berkeley, is known widely for his book, Castes of Mind. And this book even continues to be debated among the scholars cutting across academic disciplines. In this book, Nicholas B. Dirks argues very clearly that caste existed even before the arrival of colonialism in India. Right? Nevertheless, it was just one among various other social identities. It was one among various other social identities. Now the question is, but colonialism constructed caste as the only effective identity. That's the point that we are talking about. That's the point that we are emphasizing. How colonialism therefore constructed caste as the only effective identity. And similarly, Susan Bailey also in important work argues, particularly in her work Caste and Politics in the 18th century India, that in fact this work criticizes how Brahmanism and its hegemony were not a product of colonialism, though they were certainly strengthened by it. But the question, according to Susan Bailey, is that Brahmins played a significant role in construction of this colonial knowledge and the collaboration of the colonial state. And the most important aspect is the collaboration between the colonial state and the native elites and the feudal classes was neither an imagination nor a construct, but was a historical reality. So what we understand so far in this lecture is how colonialism created knowledge and how this was facilitated by colonial missionaries, anthropologists, and ethnographers. And it is in this context we need to see how Indian leaders have taken it forward. So what I'm trying to suggest is either Jyotiba Phule or Ambedkar or E.V.R. Periyar or other important social reformers, therefore, were able to follow the knowledge created by the colonial government, ably facilitated by the colonial missionaries, anthropologists, and ethnographers. I think it is in this context I would like to discuss two important case studies here. One is Jyotiba Phule and another one is Ambedkar. How they were shaped by the colonial forms of knowledge, particularly on caste question. For example, Jyotiba Phule was inspired ideologically by different missionaries and colonial scholars, including Abbe Dubois, J.C. Nesfield, colonial missionaries, and particularly Thomas Paine, an American political scientist, also influenced Jyotiba Phule more than anyone else. And in fact, as we all know, Jyotiba Phule was one of the pioneering social reformers of the 19th century from Bombay Presidency, and he initiated a series of movements against caste system and untouchability. For example, there were many studies available. I just wanted to bring to you an observation made by Gail Ombert, American-born Indian scholar who has done extensive research on Phule in one of the studies, Phule and the ideology of social revolution in India, argues that how Phule was different from, in fact, other social reformers, particularly Ram Mohan Roy and others. For example, as this particular scholar, Gail Ombert, argues that Phule followed a different set of ideas and very different outlook on India. How and why? These ideas were completely different from the upper caste thinkers of the Indian Renaissance. The upper class expressed their ideology as national revolution. Nevertheless, Phule identifies his ideology as a social revolution. Remember, the term social revolution used by Phule also was later picked up by Ambedkar and others. Even Ambedkar also, in his important work, keeps reminding how and why social reform is important for political reformation. So how social reform is important for economic reformation. So remember, everything is connected. And it is in this context we need to see how Phule played a very important role. As we understand, Phule identified his ideology as a social revolution. For example, peasants, tribals, workers, low caste, untouchable castes, therefore were his focus of attention. For example, we also need to understand one thing, how he was influenced by Christianity and missionaries and the notion of God. And Gail Ombert also argues that Phule was influenced heavily by Christianity, missionary education, and the concept of God, rationalism, liberty, equality, and fraternity. For example, as I told you, how Thomas Paine became a kind of his ideological guru. Phule, in fact, read the books of Thomas Paine, particularly the Rights of Man, written by an American political scientist, Thomas Paine. And in fact, this particular book, remember, this particular book helped him to develop a passion for social justice. And in fact, and this particular book also made Phule to say a strong no to conversion to Christianity. For example, historian Uma Chakravarti, in her works, argue that Thomas Paine's ideas about Christianity kept Jyotiba Phule away from its attractions. Similarly, after reading Age of Reason is also one of the most scholarly works of Thomas Paine. After reading this particular work, in fact, Pule also, along with his friends, rejected conversion to Christianity. This is also a point, in fact, discussed detail by Uma Chakravarti and others. Now the question is, nevertheless, Pule realized that lower caste and women were filled with problems due to lack of education. The lack of education. And it is in this context particularly Pule was forced to depend on the education provided by the colonialism, particularly by the missionaries. Nevertheless, it is very, very important that he was, in a way, supporting the continuation of the colonial government. For example, commenting on the British rule in India, Pule believed that the British rule had brought education, science, and justice to India. He also asserted that God had sent the British rule to India to correct the Hindus and their foolishness, dispelling their ignorance and removing their prejudices. Remember, it was not Pule for the first time who made and used such language. Even Ram Mohan Roy used similar such language. Even Dadabhai Naoroji used similar such language. And in fact, M.G. Ranade also used similar such language in appreciating the colonial government for providing education, science, and justice to India. And one more thing that I wanted to discuss about Pule, his first practical social reforms were in fact involved in empowering women and untouchables. So this is how he tried to question the caste system. And secondly, he wrote, as we all know, a book titled Gulamgiri, means slavery. It was written actually in Marathi language in 1885 with an English preface. And Jyotiba Phule's Gulamgiri is considered to be one of the most important contributions to criticize caste system. For example, it criticizes the institution of castes through a 16 part essay and 4 poetic compositions. In fact, it is written in the form of a dialogue between Jyotiba and a character he calls Dhondiba. So it's very interesting. I think it's available online, the translations also, how he uses these kinds of discussions and dialogues to critique the deeply embedded caste system. And for example, he was also, as I told you, influenced heavily by the colonial knowledge. And particularly in this book, he argued that the peasants and untouchables were the oppressed communities who had suffered under Brahmin slavery. So therefore, he was very critical against the notion of particularly about the Brahmins and how the Brahmins, according to him, played a very important role in suppressing communities, and therefore he was critical of Brahmins in his works. It's very important. It's also that Pule aimed for complete destruction of caste. Complete destruction. So the complete destruction in a way also was picked up by Ambedkar. So he uses complete destruction, and Ambedkar uses the term annihilation of caste or extinction of caste. So all these terms, therefore, we need to, I think, study within the context of colonialism and the knowledge produced in the colonial times. And most importantly, uh, Pule criticizes Vedas, and because he felt that Vedas were the root cause for all kinds of the social rigidity in the society. And he also therefore considered Vedas as idle imagination, foolish myths, and false consciousness. These are the terms used by Pule in his work. So the point is, this is how Pule started questioning the deeply embedded notion of caste system. So he was able to produce his knowledge about the caste system largely based on the colonial forms of knowledge. Particularly, the colonial government created a knowledge about caste system, saying that the Brahmins or the Hinduism were the root cause of the caste system. Therefore, Indian intellectuals and social reformers also had to rely on the accounts of the colonial knowledge. And it is also important how his ideology, Pule's ideology, shaped and reshaped the understanding of caste, particularly by Ambedkar and others. And when you think of Ambedkar, he was the one who also was influenced by the colonial forms of knowledge. For example, the ideological inspiration was from Abbé Dubois, again J.C. Nesfield, missionaries, and the most important African American leader, W.E.B. Du Bois. So the Du Bois played a crucial role, Abbé Dubois, and you have W.E.B. Du Bois, again the African American leader, in contesting, in critiquing the caste system. For example, Ambedkar said once, I like the religion that teaches liberty, equality, and fraternity. So these concepts, as we all know, are very explicitly expressed during the French Revolution, also attracted a great deal of attention of people like Ambedkar. For example, when we think of Ambedkar, the popular slogan, educate, unite, and agitate, right? Educate, unite, and agitate. When I was doing a little research, it was not actually Ambedkar's original use or term. This was already used by his contemporary W.E.B. Du Bois, as I told you, African American leader, and who was advocating racial integration theory in the US in the first of the 20th century. And he was the one who came out with the idea educate, unite, and agitate to interrogate the rigid social order and to liberate the African Americans from the white supremacy. So what I am trying to suggest is how the contemporary international leaders, the colonial knowledge, continue to inspire leaders like Ambedkar. For example, when we think of Ambedkar, the first important thing that comes to our mind is his most important work, Annihilation of Castes. So I will be discussing briefly what exactly he was trying to say in this Annihilation of Caste. As most of us know, that Annihilation of Caste was written for a speech to be delivered at a conference organized by Society for the Abolition of Caste System in Punjab in 1936. Nevertheless, he was not able to deliver his speech, as some caste Hindus objected him because the organizers also claimed that some of the contents in his speech, which he sent already to the conference organizers, were to be too controversial. Remember, some of the speeches, the contents of his speech were perceived to be too controversial. And when the organizers asked Ambedkar to delete the so-called offending paragraphs, Ambedkar replied sarcastically, saying that he would not change even a comma. He would not change even a comma. What does it mean? That he was persistent in his ideology, he was persistent in his interpretation, and he was confident that what he was trying to say is possibly true. What is the observation that he is making in this particular work called Annihilation of Caste? I think anyone who wants to read Ambedkar, it's important to go through his work called Annihilation of Caste. And in fact, since the organizers did not give him the opportunity to make his presentation, and he was forced to publish it on his wall. This is how it became a book, in fact. Now, let me explain briefly how Ambedkar perceived caste and how he was influenced by the colonial knowledge. It's a very, very crucial that as a critique of caste system, he always was advocating the complete denunciation of caste and Hinduism. And in this book, he was pointing out why social reform is necessary for political reform. Remember, Jyotiba Phule was using social movement, and here he is using, Ambedkar is using, in fact, the term social reform. So he was advocating social reform in the Hindu society, particularly the caste system. And he was asking questions as to why social reform is necessary for political reform. He also stated that why social reform is necessary for economic reform. So if there is no social reform, according to Ambedkar, there cannot be any political reform. If there is no social reform, there cannot be any economic reform. So according to Ambedkar, therefore, social reform is the root cause for the transformation, empowerment, and the change in the society. And what did he do to justify this particular argument? Because why did he make this important statement that there is a need for social reform in Hindu society? Because he was deeply disturbed by the fact that there was a claim of the purity of race or Hinduism. Two important factors that we need to remember as far as Ambedkar was concerned as to why he became vehement in his criticism about caste system. The first factor is he stated that caste is not a division of labor but a division of laborers. Remember, in the Vedic text, or those who argued in defense of caste system based on profession always claimed that it was a division of labor. Varna is nothing but a division of labor. But here Ambedkar disproves that. No, Varna cannot merely be a division of labor. On the contrary, it is a division of laborers. Division of laborers. And the second important criticism that he had against caste system was that caste cannot preserve a non-existent purity. He said there is nothing called pure religion. There is nothing called a pure caste. Everything is mixed, and therefore it's not possible to make an assertion that caste has its own purity. He says therefore it does not exist simply. And how did he prove his ideology? To justify his argument, he started quoting a series of works, including the works of B.R. Bhandarkar. Who was Bhandarkar? D.R. Bhandarkar was an Indian scholar, and he was also Orientalist and reformer from Bombay, right? And he worked extensively on the caste system. And Ambedkar quoted one of the works of D.R. Bhandarkar titled Foreign Elements in Hindu Population. Foreign Elements in Hindu Population. And in this work, Bhandarkar stated that there is hardly a class or caste in India which has not a foreign strain in it. There is an admixture of alien blood, not only among the warrior classes, the Rajputs, the Marathas, but also among the Brahmins, who are under the happy delusion that they are free from all foreign elements. So this is therefore very important how Ambedkar was influenced by the works of D.R. Bhandarkar, saying that there is nothing called purity of religion. And the second important point Ambedkar was making in this particular work is caste prevents Hinduism from forming a real society or nation. The third important point Ambedkar is making in this work is that the worst feature of caste system is anti-social spirit. The fourth important point Ambedkar is making is caste prevents the uplift and incorporation of the aboriginal tribes. Not only they are not civilized, but some of them follow pursuits which have led to being classified as criminals. Remember, this is how Ambedkar is making his points, that how caste is against upliftment of people. And similarly, he also says that caste, particularly the high castes, have conspired to keep the lower caste down throughout the historical period. And the next important thing, which is also very interesting, that according to Ambedkar, caste deprives Hindus of mutual help, trust, and fellow feelings. And this is the reason why he was critical how there should not be, and why there should not be a caste system which simply forbids people from getting help from one another. And he's making these kinds of issues because he feels that caste was considered as a powerful weapon for preventing all kinds of reforms. And similarly, he also says that caste destroys public spirit, public opinion, and public charity. And therefore he says, my ideal, a society based on liberty, equality, and fraternity. So if you have castes, there cannot be equality. If you have caste system, there cannot be equality, And if you have caste system, there cannot be fraternity. So these are the points understood or made persuasively by Ambedkar. And a few important aspects that we need to remember is that he always expressed apprehensions that no reformers and no appeals to reason have so far succeeded in abolishing caste system. So therefore he was expressing his discontent that social reform movements will never be able to remove caste system completely, because it is already deeply embedded entity in the Indian society. And finally, we also need to remember that if Hindu society is to progress, according to Ambedkar, if Hindu society is to progress, Ambedkar said, its traditions must be able to evolve. Traditions must be able to evolve. And we all know that he finally says, the struggle is yours. I have now decided to leave the Hindu fold. Obviously, we all know that on 14th October 1956, he publicly converted to Buddhism. I'm not going into that details. So what I'm trying to suggest is how Ambedkar also was influenced heavily by colonial knowledge about caste system and its complex situations. Now the question is how Du Bois, an African American leader, was able to influence the minds of Ambedkar, because as we all know, he was the one who came out with the idea, Du Bois, to educate, unite and agitate, to interrogate the rigid social order and to liberate the African Americans from white supremacy. But the question is, I'm trying to summarize now how Ambedkar, Jyotiba Phule and others were influenced ideologically heavily by the colonial knowledge system. For example, as historian Omar Chakravarti, in a study Gendering Caste Through a Feminist Lens, argued persuasively that both Phule and Ambedkar have emphasized on education as a powerful weapon to be used to fight the dominance of Brahminism. What we understand today, what is the most important thing that we can understand from today's lecture is, of course, there were movements for the strengthening of caste in the colonial times. Similarly, there were also movements for the abolition of caste system. You have both the categories. Now, both these entities, those who supported caste system and those who opposed caste system, derived their ideological support from the colonial anthropologists, colonial ethnographers and missionaries. Almost all the living caste group in India continues to promote, shape and strengthen caste system in one way or the other. For example, Brahmins have their caste associations, Kshatriyas also have their caste associations, Vaishyas also do have their caste associations, and Shudras do have their caste associations. But the question is it possible to eliminate the caste system completely in India? My take is very simple. Every single active caste group in contemporary India continues to shape, strengthen, and solidify this million headed hydra called caste in one way or the other. Secondly, it would hardly make any sense if the Brahminical Hinduism, as we see it today, is targeted or embattled as the only definite apparatus for keeping this million headed hydra alive. There are multiple factors at work. I'm not here to suggest that the caste system is a curse or blessing, but what I'm trying to suggest is how colonialism shaped the notion of caste as we understand it today. And we also understand from today's lecture is colonialism and its forms of knowledge, imperialist ideologies, ethnographers, anthropologists, and missionaries played crucial role in shaping, strengthening, and solidifying the caste system. This does not mean that caste system was not existing in the pre-colonial times. So once again, I thank for all those who have taken your valuable time to be part of this interesting lecture series. So I just shared what I understand. So as we all know, history is a continuous process of interaction between past and present, and history is also an unending dialogue, as E.H. Carr would identify between historians and their facts. I'm always happy to have the discussion to go on, and as we all know, there is no end for history. History will live as far as historians live in this world. So thank you once again for your patient listening.